easy to talk about jobs in raw numbers, but when we talk about these ideas of anchors and community and history and transition, it takes on a different dimension. I'm curious if you can unpack a little bit some of these concepts, because I have a sense that they have a bit more nuance and direction for you. But let's start with just transition. What does that mean in this context when you're talking about a community that may be deeply embedded in a particular geography and industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just transition is a concept. It's not a new concept. We've been talking about just transition in the economic development context for years. And essentially what it is the question of how do you transition from an industry that has anchored an economy, whether that's manufacturing, agriculture, mining. How do you transition a community when that industry goes under for some reason? And how do you do it in a way that's just? How do you do that in a way that actually respects workers and community and culture? So we've been talking about this for a long time, and I think it's interesting that it's now become such an important concept in the climate world. It's really core to the issue of resilience because we need to think about transition not just in areas where we're saying we need to close down that coal plant or we need to find alternatives to oil. I really have come to believe that climate change and climate risk is a macroeconomic trend like globalization and automation, and you can't look at it in isolation. You have to think about what does transition look like at a time where we have climate change impacts, where we do have globalization in the economy, and where there's massive automation of some of these same industries that we've been relying on for years to kind of give people jobs after transition. So I think we're at a really critical moment to rethink this whole idea.
I'd love if you could give us a little bit of color to where we're talking about here. Where are some of the communities that you're looking at? Give us, a thumbnail sketch of what their physical climate risks are and their transition and industry frameworks are. What are we talking about?
An obvious one that I'm certainly not the only person to talk about is Alaska. So Alaska is an interesting place because so much of its development has been on the back of the oil industry. The oil industry, in fact, anchored Anchorage and has really driven a huge amount of economic development there and is very embedded in the culture and the economy. Alaska is also ground zero for a lot of severe climate impacts, and we've already started seeing that in terms of warmer winters, flooding in some places, ice melt, sea level rise. There are communities that are already having to deal with actually having to move, looking at relocation. That's a very extreme example where if we're serious about climate change and what we have to do to avert it, we need to look at moving away from oil, the industry that anchors Alaska. And at the same time, a number of those communities are actually facing climate impacts today that are causing a complete upheaval of the economy. And so to me, Alaska is a really interesting example of how do we think about transition in a place that's been so anchored by this industry, but also is in such the crosshairs of physical climate impacts.
Excellent. I think it's a great example. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And you've actually brought up a couple of things that I want to further unpack a little bit. You've talked about justice, culture, identity, place-based. Can you talk about the role of that cultural identity as a factor in this confluence? Because it sounds like it's a big one.
I think it is. I mean, my sort of underlying theory is that these inherently place-based industries ground culture in a different way than kind of itinerant industries do. And one of the interesting distinctions, of course, really between most of the clean energy economy, actually, and the old, if you will, energy economy is that a mining and extraction-based economy is place-based. One of the great things about wind, solar resources, about energy efficiency, is that they're things that we can do in many, many places. They're job creators in a lot of places that have not had that before. They're distributed. People can own them. There's all kinds of great things about that.